The first time I heard my brother's voice after his funeral, it came through a handheld radio with the battery removed. He said my old call sign once. Then he told me a boy was trapped beneath the Juniper Ridge tower. There was no boy. I should probably explain why I didn't throw the radio away immediately. My name is Gabriel Mercer. Most people call me Gabe. I'm 41, and I maintain emergency communications equipment for 3 counties in eastern Oregon. Radio towers, repeaters, microwave links, backup generators. Anything that lets a deputy in a canyon talk to a dispatcher 30 miles away eventually becomes my problem. I know what radio interference sounds like. I know how voices can cross channels when equipment is badly grounded. I know about atmospheric ducting, stuck microphones, corrupted digital packets, and hobbyists who think transmitting on public safety frequencies is funny. Dead men speaking through powerless equipment isn't on that list. The radio had belonged to my older brother, Owen. He carried it during his 12 years with county search and rescue. A black Motorola with a cracked display, orange tape around the antenna, and a shallow dent where he dropped it against a granite ledge. After Owen died, his widow, Claire, gave it to me with a box of his other equipment. I put the radio on a shelf above my workbench and left it there for 6 years. The battery failed sometime during the second year. It swelled enough to split the plastic housing, so I removed it and took it to the county's hazardous waste station. The radio itself stayed on the shelf because I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Owen died during a flash flood in Dry Horse Canyon. He was alone when it happened. That detail matters. The official report said he'd entered the canyon to check an abandoned vehicle after a storm warning had already been issued. The water came faster than predicted. His truck was found wedged between 2 cottonwoods almost 4 miles downstream. They recovered Owen the next morning. I was the last person who spoke to him before he drove in. We argued over the radio. I told him he was chasing another false alarm. He told me to stay off the emergency channel unless I had something useful to say. I called him a stubborn asshole and switched my radio off. That was our final conversation. For 6 years, I remembered the exact tone of his voice when he said my name. Not angry. Tired. That was worse. The night his old radio came alive, I was in my basement repairing a damaged duplexer for the sheriff's office. It was just after 11. Claire had called earlier because it would have been Owen's 46th birthday, but I'd let it go to voicemail. That was something I did too often back then. The soldering iron was hot in my hand when the Motorola clicked behind me. Not static. A clean squelch break. I turned around. The display was dark. The battery compartment was empty. Then Owen said, "Mercer 2. I dropped the soldering iron onto the rubber mat." That had been my call sign when I volunteered with search and rescue. Owen was Mercer 1. Nobody had called me Mercer 2 since his death. The speaker popped again. Male juvenile. Juniper Ridge. Lower structure. The transmission faded into a low hiss. I stood there staring at the radio until the soldering iron started burning through the mat. My first thought wasn't Ghost. My first thought was Claire. She knew our old call signs. She also knew where I lived, and Owen's equipment had passed through her house before it came to mine. But Claire wasn't cruel, and she wasn't technical enough to build some hidden transmitter into an old handheld. My second thought was that someone had broken into the county's archived recordings. Search and rescue traffic was retained for training and liability purposes. Owen's voice existed in hundreds of audio files. Anyone with access could have assembled a convincing message. I picked up the radio. It was cold and lighter than it should have been without the battery. I checked the compartment, the accessory port, and the seam around the casing. No wires. No modifications. The radio clicked again. Mercer, too, acknowledged that was Owen. Not a recording spliced together by someone who'd heard him at work. He shortened the middle of Mercer when he was irritated. Almost swallowed the second syllable. I had spent years trying not to remember that detail, and there it was in my basement. I pressed the transmit button, even though the radio had no power. This isn't funny. The speaker remained silent. I set the radio inside a steel tool cabinet, closed the door, and locked it. Then I drove to Juniper Ridge. I told myself I was checking the tower because someone might have been illegally transmitting from the site. The boy was probably bait. The use of Owen's voice was bait too. I knew that. I went anyway. Juniper Ridge sits 13 miles outside town, at the end of a Forest Service road that stops being maintained after the first snow. The county had used the site for analog emergency traffic until 2015, when we installed a digital system on a higher ridge. The old tower was still standing, but the repeater equipment had been removed. At least that was what our records said. The access road narrowed between basalt walls before climbing into open pine forest. There were no houses nearby, and no reason for a child to be out there after midnight. I stopped twice and listened with the truck windows down. Nothing. At the site, my headlights caught the tower, the equipment shelter, and the rusted remains of a chain-link fence. The shelter door was hanging open. That alone justified the drive. I took a flashlight and the tire iron from behind my seat. I owned a gun, but it was locked in the safe at home because Owen had always said nervous people shouldn't carry loaded weapons into situations they didn't understand. I walked around the tower first. No child. No vehicle. No footprints that I could see on the hard ground. The phrase lower structure probably referred to the steel framework supporting the antenna platform, so I checked beneath it. There was nothing except rabbit droppings, old cable ties, and a faded work glove. Inside the shelter, most of the equipment racks were empty. One wasn't. A narrow gray cabinet stood against the rear wall. It was the old Channel 4 repeater, the unit we had supposedly removed years earlier. The breaker panel was open. Every breaker was switched off. I shined my light over the cabinet. The power cable had been cut near the floor. The coaxial feed line, leading to the tower had been disconnected and capped. Still, a green indicator on the repeater blinked once. I leaned closer. It blinked again. 2 seconds on. 4 seconds off. That was the receive light. It meant the unit was hearing a transmission. I opened the cabinet. Someone had removed the power supply. The space where it should have been was empty. Behind the equipment rack, I found a spiral notebook lying on the floor. Most tower sites have maintenance logs. Technicians write down arrival times, repairs, meter readings, and anything unusual. The first pages were filled with my handwriting and Owen's. We had both worked on the old system before he died. The final entry was dated 3 days before the flood. Owen had written it. Channel 4B opening without input. Return audio present after disconnect. Do not patch to county core. Below that, in different ink, he had added Gab's voice at 0 to 13. Not Gabe. I read that line several times. Then I heard something move beneath the floor. The shelter had a raised base with about 18 inches of space underneath for cables. A loose panel near my boots shifted upward and dropped. I stepped back and raised the tire iron. Hello, something scraped across the underside of the floor. I crouched and pulled the panel open. A handheld radio was wedged between 2 support beams. Not a modern digital radio. An old yellow emergency beacon with a built-in microphone and a corroded antenna. The speaker was emitting a thin, uneven sound. Crying. A child crying. I reached down and picked it up. The crying stopped. A man said, "Lower structure," Owen's voice. I threw the beacon across the room. It struck the empty rack and broke open. There were no batteries inside. I left the shelter without closing the door. The drive home took longer because I kept checking the rearview mirror. I wasn't expecting to see Owen. I was watching for headlights, telling myself someone had followed me to the tower and staged everything. When I got home, the steel cabinet in my basement was still locked. Owen's radio was inside. The following morning, I called Nina Alvarez. Nina supervised the county dispatch center. She worked nights when Owen and I volunteered together and had been on duty during the flood. She was also the person least likely to indulge me. I brought the maintenance notebook to her office, but left Owen's radio at home. Nina read the final entry without changing her expression. "Where did you get this? Juniper Ridge. That site is decommissioned. The old repeater is still there." "No, it is. I saw it." She closed the notebook. "Did you turn anything on?" "There was nothing to turn on." "That wasn't my question." I told her about the receive light. I did not tell her about Owen's radio or the beacon under the floor. Nina stood and locked her office door. "What exactly did you hear at the site?" "Why?" "Because Owen heard things there too." She opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thin folder. After Owen's death, an internal review had been conducted because he'd entered Dry Horse Canyon without a partner. I'd seen the official report. The folder Nina placed on the desk contained pages that hadn't been included. According to the dispatch notes, Owen had received a distress call 11 minutes before he drove into the canyon. The caller identified himself as me. I pushed the folder away. No, Nina didn't argue. I was home, I said. You know I was home. We called you afterward and confirmed that. What did the caller say? Nina hesitated. He said he was injured. Said his leg was trapped beneath a vehicle. The old radio phrase came back to me. Male juvenile. Lower structure. Short descriptions. Location. Injury. Dispatch language. Why wasn't this in the report? Because the call wasn't recorded in the system. All radio traffic is recorded. It appeared on Owen's portable radio, but not here. I only know about it because he called me on his personal phone while he was driving. What did he say? He asked whether you were in the canyon. I said I didn't know. Then he told me he could hear you screaming on Channel 4. My hands had started trembling, so I put them under Nina's desk where she couldn't see. That channel had been shut down. He knew that, and he still went. He thought you defound an old radio and used it because you were desperate. That sounded like Owen. Not because he was reckless. Because he was incapable of ignoring someone who might need help, even when the evidence made no sense. Nina turned the maintenance notebook toward me. He'd been investigating Juniper Ridge for weeks. He believed the old repeater was replaying emergency calls. Recordings, not exactly. She showed me several photocopied log pages. Owen had documented voices on the disconnected channel. A woman reporting a house fire that had occurred in 1998. A deputy calling for medical assistance after a shooting in 2004. A child describing a capsized fishing boat. Every incident had happened inside the repeater's former coverage area. Every caller had died. Why didn't you tell anyone? I asked. Owen asked me not to. That doesn't answer the question. He thought somebody inside the communications department was experimenting with archived audio. He wanted proof before he accused anyone. And after he died, I submitted everything I had. To whom? The county administrator. The sheriff. The state communications office. What did they do? They sent a technician to remove the repeater. It's still there. Nina looked toward the locked door. Then somebody lied. I called Claire that afternoon. I hadn't decided whether to tell her everything. I just wanted to ask about Owen's notebooks, computer backups, anything he might have left behind. Claire listened quietly. When I mentioned Juniper Ridge, she interrupted me. You went up there last night. You need to stop. Did Owen talk to you about the repeater? He talked about voices. Her answer came too quickly. I asked what she meant. For a month before he died, he barely slept. He'd sit in the garage with a radio and write down whatever he heard. Sometimes he'd wake me because he thought someone was outside. Why didn't you tell me? You two weren't speaking. We argued. That wasn't the same thing. It was to him. That hurt because it was probably true. Claire took a breath. He heard your voice more than once, Gabe. The room seemed to contract around the phone. What did I say? He wouldn't tell me. The last night, he took all the radios out of the house. He said something had learned which voice would make him answer. I looked toward the basement door. Did he ever bring his Motorola back? The black one? Yes, no. I found it in his truck after the flood. The radio spoke again that evening. I had placed it on my kitchen table, inside a clear plastic storage bin. I'd also set up 2 cameras, an audio recorder and a spectrum analyzer. At 8:42, the squelch opened. The analyzer showed no incoming radio signal. Owen said, "Vehicle rollover. County Road 17. 2 occupants." Then the radio went silent. I called Nina. She told me no accident had been reported. I stayed at home for 12 minutes. Then I grabbed my coat. County Road 17 runs through cattle country south of town. I drove slowly, watching the ditches. 7 miles in, I found a pickup upside down behind a barbed wire fence. The headlights were still on. A teenage girl was crawling through the broken passenger window. Her father was trapped behind the steering wheel. I called 911 and stayed until the ambulance arrived. The accident investigation later determined the driver had swerved to avoid a deer. The truck had rolled less than 3 minutes before I found it. The radio had warned me almost 20 minutes earlier. That changed things. I wish it hadn't. Until then, I could treat Owen's voice as a threat. After the accident, part of me started wondering whether the thing at Juniper Ridge had helped save 2 people. Maybe it wasn't luring anyone. Maybe Owen had discovered some kind of repeating signal that didn't follow time in the normal way. I know how that sounds, but once you've heard a powerless radio predict an accident, ordinary explanations become difficult to defend. Over the next 2 weeks, the radio spoke 4 more times. One transmission warned of a kitchen fire. The address was real, but the homeowner extinguished the grease fire before crews arrived. Another reported an elderly man wandering near the highway. A deputy found him 3 miles from his assisted living facility. The third message gave only coordinates. I drove there and found nothing except an empty irrigation ditch. The fourth said, "Officer needs assistance." I called Nina before moving. She checked every unit. Nobody needed help. An hour later, Deputy Colin Reeves slipped while searching a riverbank and fractured his ankle. The incident occurred inside the old Juniper Ridge coverage area. Each accurate transmission made the inaccurate ones more dangerous. I started sleeping in the basement so I wouldn't miss anything. I kept written logs with exact times and wording. That's what technicians do when equipment behaves unpredictably. We document until the pattern explains itself. Claire found out from Nina. She came to my house carrying Owen's old laptop and demanded to see the radio. I showed her. She stood in the basement doorway but wouldn't approach the workbench. "You're listening to it," she said. "I'm collecting data. That's what Owen called it. It warned me about real emergencies. It did that with him too." I looked at her. Claire set the laptop on the workbench. "There's a folder on the desktop. I couldn't open it until last week because I didn't know the password." Nina helped me. The folder contained audio files Owen had recorded during the month before his death. Most were static. In one, a woman whispered an address repeatedly. In another, a deputy shouted that he had been shot. I recognized the deputy's name from an incident that happened when I was a teenager. Then we opened a file titled Gabe Canyon. My own voice came through the laptop speakers. "Owen, I'm stuck. I can't move my left leg." The recording quality was poor, but the voice was mine. It had my nasal breathing, my habit of speaking too fast when scared, even the small click in my jaw from an old wrestling injury. Claire closed the laptop. That's what he followed into Dry Horse. I couldn't speak. "He played it for me the night before he died," she said. "He knew it wasn't you. He said the voice had copied you from old search and rescue traffic. Then why did he go? Because the next time it spoke, it knew something only you would know." "What?" He wouldn't tell me. The powerless radio clicked behind us. Claire covered her mouth. Owen said, "Claire." Blue cooler. She made a sound I had never heard from another person. Not a scream. More like the air had been pulled out of her by a rope. "What does that mean?" I asked. Claire backed toward the stairs. "At our wedding, Owen hid my shoes in a blue cooler. Nobody knew where he put them except us." The radio spoke again. "Open channel 4. Claire left without taking the laptop. That should have been the end of my involvement. Instead, I drove back to Juniper Ridge the following morning. I wanted to know how a system could transmit information from emergencies before they occurred. I wanted to know how it knew private memories. Mostly, I wanted to know why Owen had written my name in the maintenance log. Inside the shelter, the repeater's receive light was blinking continuously. I connected a diagnostic meter to the antenna port. There should have been no voltage, no carrier, and no modulation. The meter registered a signal. It wasn't coming down the feed line. It was coming from the repeater itself. I removed the casing. Behind the empty power compartment, someone had installed a small digital recorder. It looked homemade. Owen's handwriting was on the label. Isolation test 4B. I took it home. The recorder contained 37 hours of audio. Most of it was silence broken by brief transmissions. I listened at double speed until I heard Owen. He was speaking from inside the Juniper Ridge shelter. "Test sequence 12. Repeater disconnected from antenna, power and ground. Return audio continues." A second voice answered him. "Mine." "Patch it in," Owen said. "No." My recorded voice repeated, "Patch it in." Then another voice joined it. "A woman." Then a child. Then several people speaking at once. The words overlapped until they formed a single sentence. "Give us a way out." I replayed it 3 times. On the 4th pass, I heard something beneath the voices. Dispatch tones. The short electronic beeps that precede emergency announcements. That was when I understood what Owen had meant by county core. The old repeater wasn't trying to send messages to one radio. It was trying to connect to the entire emergency network. That night, a winter storm crossed the county. Freezing rain coated the roads. Wind damaged power lines in the northern district, and the digital tower at Granite Peak went offline. Our backup network should have routed traffic through Pine Junction, but a microwave link failed at the same time. Half the county lost portable radio coverage. I was called to the communications office at 1:10 in the morning. Nina met me in the equipment room. "We need temporary coverage in the west sector," she said. I knew what she was asking before she said it. "Juniper Ridge still has the right elevation." "No, we have deputies without communication. Use mobile repeaters. They can't cover the canyon roads." "Nina, that system killed Owen." "We don't know that. You showed me the logs. I showed you what Owen believed." She was scared. I could hear it in how carefully she pronounced every word. Then the dispatch speaker activated. Owen's voice filled the equipment room. "Nina Alvarez. Vehicle trapped. Mill Creek Crossing." Nina turned toward the console. The dispatcher on duty said no one had transmitted. Owen repeated the message. Nina's daughter lived beyond Mill Creek. I saw the decision happen in Nina's face. She called her daughter. No answer. The storm had taken down several cell towers, so that proved nothing. Then Owen's radio, which I had locked inside my service case, spoke from beneath the table. Water rising. Nina grabbed her coat. I stopped her at the door. "If you drive out there and this is bait, you'll be doing exactly what Owen did." What if it is? That was the question the thing used. Not is this real? What if it is? I told Nina I would restore Juniper Ridge temporarily, while she contacted a deputy near Mill Creek through the vehicle data system. My plan was to connect the old site using a portable microwave gateway. Once Granite Peak came back online, I would shut Juniper Ridge down. I knew the risk. I did it anyway. The access road was covered in ice. It took nearly an hour to reach the tower. Inside the shelter, the dead repeater was waiting. The receive light glowed steadily. I installed the gateway, connected it to the county network, and hesitated with my hand on the final cable. Owen's voice came from the equipment rack. "Gabe, not Mercer, too." "Gabe." "I'm sorry," it said. That was what I had wanted to hear for 6 years, even though Owen had nothing to apologize for. I connected the cable. Every radio in the county began transmitting at once. The sound coming from the dispatch monitor was described later as feedback. That word doesn't cover it. It was hundreds of voices. Old calls. Final calls. People reporting fires, wrecks, shootings, drownings, and children who had stopped breathing. Some were calm. Some were screaming. Some gave addresses that no longer existed. Every voice belonged to someone who had died inside the old coverage area. Then the voices began, using the names of living responders. Deputies heard dead parents asking for help. A paramedic heard her son, who was alive and asleep at home, telling her he had been hit by a car. Dispatchers received calls in their own voices, describing emergencies that had not happened yet. The network collapsed into confusion. Nina reached me through the gateway's maintenance line. Disconnected, I pulled the cable. Nothing changed. The gateway went dark, but the repeater continued transmitting through the antenna feed. The green receive light had turned red. The old unit had reached the county core, and now the county core was powering it through the feed line. To isolate the site, I needed to disconnect the antenna at the tower junction above the shelter. The lower connector had fused from heat. I put on my climbing harness. Outside, ice covered the tower rungs. Wind pulled at my jacket hard enough to shift my weight. The first 30 feet were manageable. Above that, the tower swayed. My headset kept receiving pieces of voices. Owen told me to climb faster. Nina told me to come down. My father, dead for 11 years, said my childhood nickname. Then I heard myself. Left hand slipping, I looked at my glove. My left hand slipped. The safety cable caught me before I fell more than 2 feet, but my shoulder struck the tower. The radio predicted my movements because it understood what I would do. Or I was doing what it told me because I heard the prediction. I stopped listening. That sounds simple. It was. I turned the headset volume down, but the voices vibrated through the tower itself. The antenna carried them into the steel. I could feel speech through my gloves and boots. At the upper junction, the connector was coated in ice. I couldn't loosen it with the wrench. I took out a compact hacksaw. The tower spoke in Owen's voice. "Don't cut it," I started sawing. "Nina's daughter is in the water," I kept going. "She has 3 minutes." The blade jumped and sliced through my glove. I felt warmth spread across my palm. Then Owen said something that stopped me. "Red tent. Snake River. You left me." The red tent was a memory I had never told anyone. When I was 17, Owen and I camped near the Snake River. We got into an argument, and I drove home without him. He had to hike 9 miles to a gas station. For years, he joked about it. The night before he died, we argued because he said I always disappeared when things became difficult. That was what the voice in Dry Horse Canyon must have known. Not a code. Not a technical detail. A wound. The thing had used memories, because memories made people move. I pressed the saw against the cable again. The voice changed. Owen sounded tired, exactly as he had during our last conversation. "Gabe, don't leave me twice." I cut through the feed line. There was no explosion. No scream. The vibration simply ended. The sudden absence of sound was so complete that I could hear ice particles striking my jacket. For the first time in 6 years, Owen's voice was gone. Granite Peak came back online 40 minutes later. Nina's daughter had been home the entire night. Her phone battery had died. The county described the incident as catastrophic cross-channel interference caused by obsolete equipment. Juniper Ridge was dismantled the following month. The repeater cabinet, antenna and remaining cables were transported to a state laboratory. According to the report, Investigators found no recording device capable of producing the transmissions. They also claimed the repeater had been physically incapable of operating. I resigned in the spring. Claire sold the house she had shared with Owen and moved to Idaho. We speak occasionally now. Neither of us mentions the blue cooler. I no longer keep radios in my home. For a while, I believed cutting the feed line had ended it. Then Nina sent me an audio file. She had been reviewing archived dispatch data from the night Owen died. Most of the original recording was ordinary traffic. Wind damage. A domestic disturbance. A deputy checking an abandoned vehicle. At 2:13 in the morning, Owen's voice appeared. Mercer 1 responding to Dry Horse Canyon. Beneath him, very faintly, another transmission was playing backward. Nina reversed it. The voice was mine. Not my voice from an old search and rescue recording. My voice as it sounds now. Older. Rougher. Damaged slightly from the night on the tower. I was saying 4 words. I got the channel open. Those were the exact words I had spoken to Nina after connecting Juniper Ridge to the county network. 6 years after Owen died.